Very good. Well, welcome. We're very glad to have you, and very glad that we're going to do this theme. If you consult the scholarly literature about C.S. Lewis, you might be surprised to discover that there are thinkers of big thinks who have particular views about the origins of the Chronicles of Narnia. One of the scholarly narratives runs like this. After a defeat in a debate, a philosophical debate before the Oxford Socratic Society, a chastened C.S. Lewis abandoned his apologetic efforts and retreated to fairy stories. So there's a famous incident where he was presenting a paper and got asked a question about, I think it was his argument from miracles, by Elizabeth Anscombe, who was a fellow Christian, but pointed out a weakness in his argument. And they went round and round, and everybody seems to think she got the best of him. He ended up changing that portion of the argument later for publication, but that this was a huge blow to Lewis's ego. And in response, he retreated from the battlefield of philosophical debate and instead decided, I'm going to revert to childhood and write silly little children's stories. Now, obviously, many Lewis scholars also dispute that account. Narnia was no retreat from his apologetic efforts, but instead a new manifestation of that calling to teach and to delight. After all, that's what great literature does. And so that's what I want to talk about, is I want to talk about the way that Lewis weaves together in this book some of his apologetic efforts to this delightful story. And I'm going to do so with a focus on enchantments. And I could survey the various types of enchantments in the story. You've got the White Witch turning people into stone. Of course, you got the enchanted Turkish delight, which, by the way, many a child, after reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, has sought to get their hands on some of that particular delicacy and discovered in the process that Edmund's request for that treat was actually a sign that he was already on the White Witch's side. Which is why I particularly appreciate that Forrest Dickinson's drawing here behind me, Turkish delight is being more fittingly used as a projectile weapon. But rather than, I'm actually going to focus my two talks today and tomorrow on one scene from one chapter from The Silver Chair, the encounter with the witch in Underland, and I'm going to try to again show how Lewis wove his apologetics into a story featuring talking owls, friendly giants, and depressed gnomes. Now, why devote two talks in a conference to one scene in one book? Well, the simple answer is because I really, really like it. What Lewis accomplishes in 12 short pages is remarkable because he not only expresses modernity's most potent objection against the Christian faith, but he also portrays the background factors that give that objection its power. And more than that, he frames modernity as a kind of dark enchantment, vividly depicting the psychological pull of unbelief and atheism. And more importantly, in the actions and speech of Puddleglum the Marshwiggle, he shows us how to break the spell and fight the fight of faith in the modern world. Now, a second reason I've chosen to do it is that I've been edified and helped by this scene personally, and I think it could be helpful to you as well, particularly if you're the sort of person who has ever struggled in any kind of way with any doubts about the Christian faith. If you've ever had a fog of unbelief descend upon you and ruin your day, or your week, or your month, or your year. Or perhaps you're not that person yourself. You're not the person who's been through the season of doubt, but you're a family or member or friend of someone who is, and you'd like to know how to better help them when those seasons come. My hope is that this will be helpful to you. And even though these two talks are mainly about one scene, have no fear. What Lewis thought about everything is present in what he said about anything. There are backroads in his thought, connections between his fiction and his prose, his poetry, his fantasy, between Narnia and Screwtape and Mere Christianity and Weight of Glory, Pilgrim's Regress, Abolition of Man, and a half a dozen apologetics essays. We'll visit them all. There is a wood between the worlds of Lewis, and I'd like to jump from the witch's underground castle into a number of them with you. So, recall the scene. Puddleglum, Eustace, and Jill have just liberated Prince Rilian from his enslavement to the Silver Chair. And as the four prepare to leave, the witch returns, has a flash of anger, but then changes her tone, addresses the prince, asking him why he's not bound in that chair for safety. The prince shivers. It's not easy to throw off in half an hour an enchantment which has made one a slave for 10 years. He then tells the witch that he rejects her plan to invade Overworld and declares his true identity. I am Rillian, son of Caspian the 10th, and states his intention to leave. We'll pick up there. Now the witch said nothing at all, but moved gently across the room, always keeping her face and eyes toward the prince. When she had come to a little ark set in the wall not far from the fireplace, she opened it, took out a handful of green powder. She threw it on the fire. It didn't blaze much, but a very sweet and drowsy smell came from it. And all through the conversation which followed, that smell grew stronger and filled the room and made it harder to think. Secondly, she took out a musical instrument, rather like a mandolin. She began to play it with her fingers, a steady, monotonous thrumming that you didn't notice after a few minutes. But the less you noticed it, the more it got into your brain and your blood. This also made it hard to think. And after she'd thrummed for a time and the sweet smell was now strong, she began to speak in a sweet, quiet voice. Narnia, she said, Narnia. I've often heard your lordship utter that name in your ravings. Dear prince, you are very sick. There's no land Narnia. Oh, yes, there is, though, ma'am, said Puddleglum. You see, I happen to have lived there all my life. Indeed, said the witch. Tell me, I pray you, where that country is. Up there, said Puddleglum, pointing upward. I don't know exactly where. Oh, how, said the queen with a kind, soft, musical laugh. Is there a country up among the stones and mortar of the roof? No, said Puddleglum, struggling a little to get his breath. It's in Overworld. And what or where, pray, is this, how do you call it, Overworld? Oh, don't be silly, said Scrub, who was fighting hard against the enchantment of the sweet smell and the thrumming. As if you didn't know. It's up above, up where you can see the sky and the sun and the stars. Why, you've been there yourself. We met you there. I cry you mercy, little brother, laughed the witch. You couldn't have heard a lovelier laugh. I have no memory of that meeting, but we often meet our friends in strange places when we dream. And unless all dreamed alike, you must not ask them to remember it. Madam, said the prince sternly, I've already told your grace that I am the king's son of Narnia. And shalt be, dear friend, said the witch in a soothing voice, as if she was humoring a child, shalt be king of many imagined lands in thy fancies. We've been there too, snapped Jill. She was very angry because she could feel enchantment getting hold of her every moment. But of course, the very fact that she could still feel it showed that it had not yet fully worked. And thou art queen of Narnia too, I doubt not, pretty one, said the witch in the same coaxing, half-mocking tone. I'm nothing of the sort, said Jill, stamping her foot. We come from another world. Why, this is a prettier game than the other. Tell us, little maid, where is this other world? What ships and chariots go between it and ours? Of course, a lot of things darted into Jill's head at once. Experiment house, Adela Pennyfather, her own home, radio sets, cinemas, cars, airplanes, ration books, and queues. But they seemed dim and far away. Thrum, thrum, thrum went the strings of the instrument. Jill couldn't remember the names of the things in our world. And this time it didn't come into her head that she was being enchanted, for now the magic was in its full strength, and of course, the more enchanted you get, the more certain you feel that you're not enchanted at all. She found herself saying, and at the moment it was a relief to say, No, I suppose that other world must all be a dream. Yes, it is all a dream, said the witch, always thrumming. Yes, all a dream, said Jill. There never was such a world, said the witch. No, said Jill and Scrub, never was such a world. There never was any world but mine, said the witch. There never was any world but yours, said they. Now, Puddleglum was still fighting hard. I don't know rightly what you all mean by a world, he said, talking like a man who hasn't enough air, but you can play that till your fingers drop off, and you still won't make me forget Narnia, and the whole overworld too. We'll never see it again, I shouldn't wonder. You may have blotted it out and turned it dark like this, for all I know. Nothing more likely. But I know I was there once. I seen the sky full of stars. I've seen the sun coming up out of the sea of a morning and sinking behind the mountains at night. And I've seen him up in the midday sky when I couldn't look at him for brightness. Puddleglum's words had a rousing effect. The other three all breathed again and looked at one another like people newly waked. Why, there it is, cried the prince. Of course, the blessing of Aslan upon this honest marshwiggle. We've all been dreaming these last few minutes. How could we have forgotten it? Of course, we've all seen the sun. By Jove, so we have, said Scrub. Good for you, Puddleglum. You're the only one of us with any sense, I do believe. Then came the witch's voice, cooing softly like the voice of a wood pigeon from the high elms in an old garden at 3 o'clock in the middle of a sleepy summer afternoon. And it said, What is this sun that you all speak of? Do you mean anything by the word? Oh, yes, we jolly well do, said Scrub. Can you tell me what it's like? Asked the witch. Thrum, thrum, thrum went the strings. Please it, your grace, said the prince very coldly and politely. You see that lamp, it is round and yellow and gives light to the whole room, and hangeth moreover from the roof. Now that thing which we call the sun is like the lamp, only far greater and brighter. It giveth light to the whole overworld, and hangeth in the sky. Hangeth from what, my lord? Asked the witch. And then, while they were all still thinking how to answer her, she added, with another of her soft silver laughs, You see, when you try to think out clearly what this sun must be, you cannot tell me. You can only tell me it's like the lamp. Your sun is a dream, and there's nothing in that dream that was not copied from the lamp. The lamp is the real thing. The sun is but a tale, a children's story. Yes, I see now, said Jill in a heavy, hopeless tone. It must be so. And while she said this, it seemed to her to be very good sense. Slowly and gravely the witch repeated, There is no sun. And they all said nothing. And she repeated in a softer and deeper voice, There is no sun. And after a pause and after a struggle in their minds, all four of them said together, You are right, there is no sun. It was such a relief to give in and say it. There never was a sun, said the witch. No, there never was a sun, said the prince and the marshwiggle and the children. Now, for the last few minutes, Jill had been feeling that there was something she must remember at all cost, and now she did. It was dreadfully hard to say it. She felt as if huge weights were laid on her lips, and at last, with an effort that seemed to take all of the good out of her, she said, There's Aslan. Aslan, said the witch, quickening ever so slightly the pace of her thrumming. What a pretty name. What does it mean? He's the great lion who called us out of our own world, said Scrub, and sent us into this to find Prince Rilian. What is a lion? Asked the witch. Oh, hang it all, said Scrub. Don't you know? How can we describe it to her? Have you ever seen a cat? Surely, said the queen, I love cats. Well, a lion is a little bit, but only a little bit, mind you, like a huge cat with a mane, at least not like a horse's mane, you know. It's more like a judge's wig, and it's yellow, and terrifically strong. The witch shook her head. I see, she said, that we should do no better with your lion, as you call it, than we did with your sun. You have seen lamps, and so you imagined a bigger and better lamp and called it the sun. You've seen cats, and now you want a bigger and better cat, and it's to be called a lion. Well, 'tis a pretty make-believe, though, to say the truth, it would suit you all better if you were younger. And look how you can put nothing into your make-believe without copying it from the real world, this world of mine, which is the only world. But even you children are too old for such play. And as for you, my lord prince, that are a man full grown, fie upon you! Are you not ashamed of such toys? Come, all of you, put away these childish tricks. I have work for all of you in the real world. There is no Narnia, no overworld, no sky, no sun, no Aslan. And now to bed all, and let us begin a wiser life tomorrow. First to bed, to sleep, deep sleep, soft pillows, sleep without foolish dreams. Now, the main thing I want to do tonight is get clear on the nature of that enchantment. And I want to explore it under four headings: the argument, the tone, the background, and the response. Let's begin with the argument. Her major claim is relatively simple. Narnia and all of Overworld is a fiction, a fantasy, fairy tale. It's not real. And the real world is set in opposition to the dream world, filled with the sun and the moon and stars and Narnia and Aslan himself. These are make-believe, the fruit of childish imaginations. So in her telling, the witch is a committed realist, and she insists that the prince and the children in the marshwiggle set aside their juvenile fairy tales and live and move and have their being in the real world, this world of mine, which is the only world. And when they try to insist that the Narnia and the sun and Aslan are in fact real, she engages in a subtle game of debunking or unmasking. And you can view her argument from two directions: projection or reduction. So they go hand in hand. So on the one hand, she argues that the sun and the lions are merely projections of lamps and cats. Or you could come at it the other way, and you could say that the sun and the lions may be reduced to lamps and cats. And that argument, of course, is built on the similarities between the sun and the lamp and the Aslan and the cats, and similarities that the heroes themselves admit. But in the witch's telling, those similarities are owing to the fact that one is copied from the other. Now, we can call this philosophy reductive realism, or scientific reductionism. That's the form we encounter it most often. It's the view that all of reality can be reduced to the material causes that science is able to study. So the world and all that it contains is simply chemicals in motion, atoms banging about, molecules flying every which way. Some philosophers have labeled that kind of reductionism nothing buttery, because everything we can see and know is nothing but a mixture of matter and motion. So humans are nothing but sacks of protoplasm. Children are just smaller, cuter sacks, like baggies of protoplasm. Love is nothing but a chemical reaction in someone's brain designed to facilitate the survival of the species. Far from being man's best friend, a dog is nothing but the current product of a random evolutionary process that is leading us nobody knows where. Thinkers like Ludwig Feuerbach and Sigmund Freud from the 19th century sought to demonstrate this by arguing that the higher aspects of human nature, things like love and justice, were simply dressed up versions of lower, more base impulses. So, love and lust are really the same thing at bottom because they both end in the same physical act. Revenge and justice, same thing. You can dress it up however you want, but in the end, the criminal is executed either way. Love and justice, in other words, can be reduced to lust and revenge. Now, religion in particular came in for this treatment, and Lewis connected that in his book, Pilgrim's Regress, which is his semi-autobiographical allegory that echoes Bunyan's famous story. In that story, the pilgrim, John, he's on a quest to find the object of his deepest desires, this island in the west that he's seen in his visions. And as he journeys trying to find this island, he encounters old Mr. Enlightenment and his son, whose name is Sigismund. Okay, this is Freud. In the land of Zeitgeistheim, which is great. The land of the Zeitgeist, the land of the spirit of the age. And Sigismund, Freud, arrests John the Pilgrim, throws him into prison, and tells him it's no use trying to escape because there's nowhere to escape to. He explains that there is no island in the West. John's belief in the island's reality is really only wish fulfillment. It's a mask, a pretense that you put up, he says, to conceal your own lusts from yourself. You've got a complex. Instead, in fact, Sigismund in the story, almost everything is wish fulfillment. Lewis in his essays calls this the doctrine of the concealed wish, which is the idea that our beliefs, what we believe, are merely masks for our wishes, desires, and needs. And these modern thinkers are here very helpfully to unmask and debunk our fantasies and to give us the real story. John in the story is imprisoned under the watchful eye of a giant called the Spirit of the Age, and the giant has a special power. Quote, whatever he looked upon became transparent. So whatever the giant looked at became transparent. This means that when the giant looked at a woman and John looked at that same woman, he didn't see the woman. Instead, he saw through her to her skull and brains and innards and blood. He looked at an old man and he saw the same, but with cancer gnawing away at his insides. With the idea being that this is what the world is really like, not the superficial artifice that we throw up. And of course, it was no leap to apply that method of debunking to belief in God. So Freud and Feuerbach argued that human beings have actually created God in our own image. God is a projection of our yearnings and desires and needs. Feuerbach famously said, he's the guy who said, if man were a being of the birds, then God would have wings. If man were a being of the birds, so if we had wings, then God would have wings because we would project our winginess into the sky. Freud had a similar argument. He said, look, when we're children, we're dependent upon our parents, and we come to see them, and especially our fathers, as strong protectors who provide us with food and shelter and physical safety and security. And then we grow up and we discover Dad's not as all-powerful as I thought he was. He has failures, he has weaknesses. But in realizing that weakness and those failures, we still have a psychological need for that security and provision. We want to know that someone strong and loving is looking out for us. And so we project our earthly fathers into the sky and invent our Father who art in heaven. And that gives us the illusion of control. It helps us make sense of the world. Good things, when they happen to us, is because God is happy with us. He's loving us. He's protecting us. When bad things happen to us, it's because he's angry at us. And Freud argued, look, now that we know where belief in God comes from, we can put it aside, and because of science and technology, we can grow up. We can stand on our own 2 feet. In other words, for Freud, God the Father is simply a copy and projection of earthly fatherhood. Just like the sun is a fictional copy and projection of the lamp, and Aslan is simply a bigger and better cat. And that copy, this is key, is the result of our disappointment with the original. Lewis once wrote, "Things do look so very much as if our whole faith were a substitute for the real well-being we have failed to achieve on earth. It seems so very likely that our rejection of the world, the physical world, Christians' rejection, is only the disappointed fox's attempt to convince himself that unobtainable grapes are really sour." In other words, all of this is simply a pretty make-believe. It helps us cope with the bleakness of reality. Well, so much for the argument. Consider briefly the tone, the rhetoric. I wonder if you noticed, after that flash of anger, that the witch adopts this sweet, kind, and musical tone throughout the conversation. She laughs easily and often. It's a lovely laugh. It gives an appearance of softness and niceness to her questions. More than that, she often has this coaxing, half-mocking tone, as if she was humoring a child. And that patronizing demeanor is actually crucial to the spell, to the enchantment. She's treating the children and the prince and the marshwiggle as, well, children, patting them on the head for their vivid imaginations and make-believe, but softly rebuking them with that lovely laugh for their childishness. It's time to grow up, put away childish things. And the prince in particular, as the oldest, receives a mocking rebuke. He ought to know better after all. A man full grown, believing these fairy tales. Now, the real world counterpart to that is the patronizing mockery and scorn heaped upon those who continue to believe in God and heaven and the gospel by those who have grown out of it. So when Puddleglum insists Narnia is real and it's up there, the witch responds with, "Is there a country on my roof?" It's the same thing that the Russians did when they first went to outer space, and they came back declaring that God was not real. We went up and we looked. We did not see him. Now, while often lacking the witch's playfulness, contemporary unbelievers regularly patronize and deride those who continue to cling to the crutch of Christ. Think of the way that a term like sky daddy is deployed not really as an argument, but as a term of derision, a rhetorical dismissal to get you to shut up. Now, that rhetoric appeals to the natural human desire we have to be taken seriously. We want to be mature. We want to be grown up. We want people to think that we're something. And so when the witch, every time she does that, she is assuming the center. She is saying, my way of looking at the world is normal. Your way is childish. My way is grown up. Yours is juvenile. And we catch a glimpse, perhaps, of our own anger at being patronized when Jill stamps her foot. None of us like to be laughed at or mocked or treated with dismissal. And so if we can be conditioned into regarding Christianity as juvenile and silly, we're halfway to giving the whole thing up. But beyond the arguments and the tone, Lewis insists that there is something more that makes her arguments potent. There's incense and thrumming, smells and bells, drowsy scents and mood music, something in the air that puts us under the spell and makes it hard to think. Now, I just want to underscore at this point something I think is really profound, is that Lewis, unlike many others, frames modernity, the modern world, not in terms of disenchantment, in other words, but as a dark enchantment. So the standard narrative about the modern world is that the world used to be enchanted. We used to believe in all these things like fairies and angels and God, but it's lost its magic and luster because science has revealed what the world really is, and the world has become disenchanted. Lewis doesn't frame it that way. He says, no, actually, the modern world is the one that's darkly enchanted. It's not that the reason that you experience the world as unmagical, that you don't intuitively experience all of the supernatural elements of reality, the reason is because you and I have been put under a dark enchantment. This is a recurring theme in his apologetics. If you remember his famous essay, The Weight of Glory, the one in which he talks about that inconsolable longing we have for we know not what. It's got that famous bit we all love to quote, where we encounter beautiful things, but the beauty's not in them, it comes through them. They are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we've never yet visited. These evocative tones of like, we're longing for something and we don't even know really what it is. Lewis follows that up immediately with this, listen. Do you think I am trying to weave a spell? Perhaps I am. But remember your fairy tales. Spells are used for breaking enchantments as well as for inducing them. And you and I have need of the strongest spell that can be found to wake us from the evil enchantment of worldliness which has been laid upon us for nearly 100 years. He goes on to say that our entire educational system and all of our modern philosophies are devoted to silencing our desire for another world. To seek it, to convince us that the good of man is to be found on this earth. In other words, like the witch, there is no world but Underland. So what does he mean by the evil enchantment of worldliness that our educational system insists upon foisting upon us? Well, we could talk here about the myth of universal evolutionism. Lewis talks about this a lot. He gives it a number of different names, the scientific outlook, and he distinguishes the myth from the scientific theories which are thought to support it. So the basic idea of the myth is that small things, chaotic things, feeble things are always turning themselves into large and strong and ordered things. That's the pattern of the universe, from small beginnings to great endings, from simple to elaborate. It makes it natural to think that morality springs from taboos, adult sentiments from infantile sexual maladjustments, thought arises from instinct, mind from matter, organic from inorganic, cosmos from chaos. So that idea, that evolutionary idea that runs through all of those things, Lewis says is the deepest habit of mind in the contemporary world. Say that again. The deepest habit of mind in the contemporary world is that things spontaneously, always, inevitably just move from simple to complex, from chaotic to ordered, from small to large. He calls this a work of folk imagination. The myth of evolution, he says, is a work of folk imagination. It takes bits from scientific theories, it grabs a couple of different things, but then it modifies them in service of the imaginative and emotional need for a unified view of the universe. And he summarizes the myth really potently in a couple of essays. I'm going to read one of them for you. This is, I think, from Is Theology Poetry? And he summarizes the myth of evolution. The play is preceded by the most austere of all preludes, the infinite void, matter restlessly moving to bring forth it knows not what. Then by the millionth chance, what tragic irony, the conditions at one point of space and time bubble up into that tiny fermentation, the beginning of life. Now everything seems to be against the infant hero of our drama, just as everything seems against the youngest son or the stepdaughter at the opening of a fairy tale. But life wins through. With infinite suffering against all but insuperable obstacles, it spreads, it breeds, it complicates itself. From the amoeba to the plant, up to the reptile to the mammal. We glance briefly at the age of monsters. Dragons prowl the earth and devour one another and die. Then comes the theme of the younger son and the ugly duckling once more. The weak, tiny spark of life that began amidst the hostilities of the inanimate, so now again, amidst the beasts that are far larger and stronger than he, there comes forth a little naked, shivering, cowering creature, shuffling, not yet erect, promising nothing, the product of another millionth chance. Yet he thrives somehow. He becomes the caveman with his club and his flints, muttering and growling over his enemy's bones, dragging his screaming mate by her hair. I never could quite make out why. Tearing his children to pieces in fierce jealousy till one of them is old enough to tear him. But these are only the growing pains. The next act. He is becoming true man. He learns to master nature. Science comes. It dissipates the superstitions of his infancy. He becomes the controller of his own fate. And passing hastily over the present moment, it's a mere nothing in the timescale we're using, you follow him on into the future. You see him in the last act, though not the last scene of this great mystery. A race of demigods now rules the planet, perhaps more than the planet. For eugenics have made certain that only demigods will be born, and psychoanalysis that none of them shall lose or smirch his divinity. and communism has ensured that all which divinity requires shall be ready to their hands. Man has ascended his throne. Henceforth he has nothing to do but practice his virtue, to grow in wisdom and to be happy. And now, here's the final stroke of genius. If the myth stopped at this point, it might sound a little pathetic. It would lack the highest grandeur of human imagination. But the last scene reverses everything. The twilight of the gods. All this time, silently, unceasingly, out of reach of human power, nature, that old enemy, has been steadily gnawing away. The sun will cool. All suns will cool. The whole universe will run down. Life, every form of life, will be banished without hope of return from every inch of infinite space. All ends in nothingness, and universal darkness covers all. He says, this pattern of the myth is one of the most noble we can conceive. It's the pattern of many Elizabethan tragedies. You see the hero climbing up and up, blazing in his glory, and then overwhelmed in ruin and seen. Now, the important thing here is that Lewis is saying that myth operates not on your reason, but on your imagination. It's an appeal to your emotion. It shapes the way you view the world, the way you interpret facts and data. He says it gives us everything the imagination craves: irony, heroism, vastness, unity, tragic close. This is what he says. It appeals to every part of me except my reason. And he goes on to say, if you think when you're trying to convince people that that myth is false, that you're trying to deliver them from something flat that starves the soul, he says, no. It is our painful duty, he says, to wake the world from an enchantment. That last line is key. This is what's placing us under an enchantment. Or more precisely, it's the background which gives those debunkers fuel. It's what makes that argument that God and morality are just projections of psychological needs plausible. Of course, you can see it in the scene from the silver chair. You remember how the witch continually gets the heroes to repeat after me. There is no sun. There never was any sun. In other words, she expects them to recite their catechism, to repeat it together and therefore collectively reinforce it for each other. It's not just that they say it individually. Everybody has to sing along. Now, consider the ways that our society catechizes us in the myth of evolution, always framing scientific and historical claims in the light of that big story. Vast stretches of time and distance, words like millions and billions generously deployed to overawe your imagination. And I just want to underline the importance of this because I suspect at a conference like this, the vast majority of us are ostensibly committed to a young earth view of the creation. Like we are. I suspect that in this room, most of you are. But I wonder if you've ever tried to do something, the imaginative work of do you actually think, in your bones, that the universe is 6,000 years old? When you try to do that, when you think about all the things you've learned and picked up over your life, all the little bits and pieces, if you try to fit cavemen, dinosaurs, galaxies, nebulae, Chinese dynasties, Mesoamerican civilizations, if you try to fit all of that into 6,000 years, what happens to does it feel weird? Does it feel like it doesn't fit? Something's off. If you think, okay, from right now, go back in time 2,000 years to the time of Christ. Go back another 2,000 years to the time of Abraham, and 2,000 years more to Adam and Eve in the garden, and a week ago God said, let there be light. If you try to imaginatively do it, not just as a box check on your confessional exam, what happens? Do you feel the pressure of that larger myth exerting itself and trying to squeeze you? There is no sun. There never was any world but mine. Millions and billions and millions and billions and millions and billions. For those who have been catechized into the myth, it's difficult to rearrange that imaginative furniture. So then, we have an argument. It's all projection, nothing buttery, patronizing mockery, and the repetition of this catechism. There is no sun. But there's one more element I wanted to highlight, and if I had more time, I would develop it more fully. But a friend of mine, Dr. Joseph Minnick, has written a couple of books about the effect of our technologies as the background noise that makes atheism and unbelief plausible. And in those books, one's called Enduring Divine Absence and the other is Bulwarks of Unbelief. He's exploring this question of why is it in the modern world that divine silence leads so naturally to divine non-existence. So in the history of humanity, divine silence, divine absence is a perennial problem. You go to your Bible, you read the Psalms, where are you, God? Where are you, God? Why? How long, O Lord? Where are you? But for the ancient man, God's absence almost never resulted in the conclusion, he's not there. Instead, it was, what did I do wrong? Right? You might wrestle with, does he really love me? Have I sinned in some way to alienate myself from him? You might wrestle with them together, like in the book of Job. But divine silence and divine absence, the fact that God is not a concrete individual that like pops out of the sky every day and says, hey, everybody, just having some God time, right? He doesn't do that. And some people are unnerved. We say, well, the reason he doesn't is because he's not there. He wants to think, why did the modern world lead to that? Where'd that come from? And his argument is that the subtraction story that we talked about earlier, this idea that God used to explain lots of stuff, then science came along and it replaced him. God's unnecessary, we don't need him. Minnick goes on to argue that our modern technoculture, that means the way that we use our technologies, the way that we use all of the built environment that we have, is always conditioning us to think that certain things are real and certain things don't matter. He says, modern technoculture makes unbelief a living option by posturing us towards reality in such a way that it seems devoid of any immaterial or spiritual dimension. Because all of our modern technoculture, I'm thinking about, just think about your devices, things like this, okay? They condition us to think that the only parts of reality that really matter, that are really real, are the parts that we can manipulate. If we can't manipulate it, is it even there? Like, does it even exist? And God, who's a being who we can't manipulate. This is what, when unbelievers throw in your face, haven't you ever prayed for something and it didn't happen? And they say, see, that's because you were calling a line and there was nobody on the other end. They didn't pick up because they weren't there. Because the whole modern mind is, it's only real if you can rearrange its part. Reality, the things that are real are malleable, shapeable, manipulable, because the imperative of the modern world is control. The lust to know, more and more knowledge, leading to more and more control, which leads to more and more sense of the only things that are real are the controllable things. And so that's the background noise. That's the idea. He talks about the toolification of reality, the idea that that reality is subjected to human desires, human impulses. That makes it easier to think that the only things that are real are the things that we can toolify. Now, I want to call this the materialist mood. It's a mood. It's a mood. And the witch, with the incense and the thrumming, is playing materialist mood music. And that gives the background noise that makes her reductionism seem like, hey, maybe that's true. Maybe God is just a projection of my deepest psychological needs. Your imagination has been primed. So, in conclusion here, we're now in a position to grasp the full picture of an enchantment. A projection argument, Narnia, the Sun, and Aslan, these are just wish fulfillment dreams, copies of the material world, which is the only real world. And they're enlarged and projected into the sky as coping mechanisms because the world's a real hard place. That's buttressed by that nothing buttery of scientific reductionism. It's strengthened by a patronizing tone of mockery that assumes the center and the repetition of the witch's evolutionary catechism. And then there's something in the air, that monotonous thrumming and sweet-smelling incense that is the myth of universal evolution and modern technoculture. That's the dark enchantment. Not just a spell, but a tone. Not just a tone, but a myth. Not just a myth, but an atmosphere which gets into your blood and makes it very hard to think. The last thing I want to talk about is the results. Think in terms of three broad categories in terms of how we respond to that spell. The first is in the story itself. It's that being lulled to sleep, that psychological relief of giving in. You heard it, right? Over and over again, Jill said, whenever she would finally give in and say, it must be so, it felt like made a lot of good sense, and there was kind of like I can finally admit the way I can face the facts. So some people experience the myth that way. They feel when they fall into unbelief like it's a giving up and a giving in to the way the universe really is. But there are other reactions. Elsewhere in Lewis's writings, he talks about the existential horror that we sometimes feel when we face the way the world really is. This meaningless cosmos, a shift. So in Pilgrim's Regress, I mentioned earlier, when John is in that prison of the spirits of the age, and this is the way the world really is. He says, I dreamed of all these creatures living in that hole under the giant's eye for many days and nights. And John looked round on it all, and suddenly he fell on his face, thrust his hands into his eyes, and cried out, it is the black hole. There may be no landlord, but it is true about the black hole. I am mad. I am dead. I am in hell forever. Some experience their doubts that way. Ransom in Perelandra has a similar encounter with Weston. You remember that scene where Weston sort of articulates this same idea of the meaninglessness of the cosmos. And at one point, Ransom's mind is sort of overtaken by that view of the universe. Reality was meaningless, unmade, idiotic, and all spirits were irrelevant, and all of our efforts were in vain. And then there's a third possible response, the one that atheists themselves often put on, that of courage and bravery, because we've faced the facts. Yes, the reality is bleak, material. There is no heaven, there is no God, there is no purpose, there is no meaning, and we are the few who have the courage to face it. You can also hear a little bit of the pat on the back and the self-flattery involved in that particular response. But the atheists think of themselves as the honest and brave ones who have the mental fortitude to face the facts. Now, good stories often have cliffhangers. I think that Nate might talk about some good stories here in a minute. So we're going to pick up there tomorrow. It's a great note to end on. But for now, I want you to see at least one thing. That way of presenting the modern problem ought to at least be a little bit deflationary for any temptations to unbelief you may have. Once you realize the play that's being run on you, knowing that modernity, the entire modern world, has primed you to doubt obvious things like the existence of God. Like when you think about it, like the Bible says that God's existence is obvious, evident, clearly perceived, can't miss it. It's the most obvious thing there is. Paul thought that way. And the entire modern world has been devoted to smothering that obviousness. And when you realize that the modern world has catechized you constantly, conditioned you constantly into unbelief, and that there's a devil who's exploited those tools to smother you with the materialist mood, that ought to make you do what Ransom did, which is, get out of my head. Get out of my head. But reducing the pull is not the same thing as defying and conquering the pull of unbelief. For that, we'll need to hear from Puddleglum, and we'll do that tomorrow. Thank you.